Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast, our last podcast of the semester, and it's on cancer. Throughout the semester, we've learned about many different pathways and concepts that help maintain and generate healthy cells. We've learned about how metabolism is important in maintaining this healthy cell. We've talked about how maintaining the proper chromosome is important in maintaining a healthy cell. We've talked about how gene regulation, not a great deal about gene regulation, but we talked a little bit about it, and how that's important to maintain a healthy cell. We've talked about the importance of the cell cycle, and with the cell cycle, how different signals will tell the cell to grow, not grow, divide, and so forth, but how that's important in maintaining the healthy cell cycle. We've talked about membrane transport and its relation to a healthy cell. We've talked about the cytoskeleton, the three different kinds that help make this healthy cell. We've talked about cell junctions and cell signaling and their relation to healthy cells. We've talked about how we make proteins and how that helps make our healthy cell. And in that same conversation, we talked about enzymes and cellular reactions. We've talked about organelles and the functions of those organelles and how that's important in healthy cells. And to some extent, we've talked about gene maintenance, how genes within this healthy cell help regulate many of these processes. We've talked about how all of these processes and many more are needed to help this cell survive, to grow, to die. In fact, we should put apoptosis down here. So we've talked about how all of these are important. So this cell knows what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to function. And every now and then, one of these cells will not do one of these things particularly well. But if you're talking about a multicellular organism, say this lovely human being here, that contains 10 trillion cells or more, if one of these cells goes rogue and doesn't perform one of these functions perfectly well, that's probably okay. Here's this person's rogue cell. The immune system can respond to that, or maybe that cell just exists. However, when that cell gains certain mutations, it can begin to disrupt the local tissues in this area, and then it can begin to cause that tissue to not function properly. Over time, those mutated cells can begin to spread throughout the body and eventually lead to the demise of the organism itself. And of course, what I'm talking about there is cancer. When one cell goes rogue, so to speak, and then avoid the signals that tells it it should die or not continue to grow, and so it keeps growing, it disrupts those tissues and eventually can spread to other parts of the body. And to understand this phenomenon, we have to understand all of these things. You have to understand the basic biology in order to understand what cancer is doing. So when all of these, or some of them, begin to function improperly, we can get cells that avoid those signals, and we end up with cancer cells. How do these cancer cells form? Well, I said these things become dysregulated to some extent, but the events that lead to the disruption of these processes are largely defined by the environment of the individual. Chemicals they're exposed to, lifestyle choices, this is a major contributor to forming cancer. And there is, of course, the genetic influence. And we want to talk about the environmental influence and the genetic influence to understand how when these things fail, we end up with cancer. So let's begin with a simple definition or description of what is cancer. In describing what cancer is, there are two features that must occur for a cancer to exist. And the first is growth. And this means growth even though the cell isn't signaled to grow. The cell's receiving every signal to not grow or to die, but it's ignoring those signals and it continues to grow. And the second feature of a cancer is that it invades. It moves to other tissues and colonizes in these other tissues. If it's just growing without invading, we would call that a benign tumor. It can still be problematic. It can still impinge upon the function of that tissue or the organ that it exists in, but it's not a cancer yet. It's a benign tumor. However, once that tumor starts to invade other tissues, then we say it is a malignant tumor. Or we say that the tumor has metastasized. So for instance, we could draw a picture, because we like to draw pictures. Okay, I like to draw pictures. So if we had a set of cells here that started to grow a little bit out of control, and then maybe over time, these cells would even grow a little bit more. And I'm going to color these in, and I'll explain why in a moment. So it gets bigger and bigger. It's growing without control and without responding to signals to tell it to stop growing. And the reason I drew these circles colored in is to signify that as these cells continue to grow out of control, they will accumulate more mutations, and they will begin to look different. They will begin to look different than the original cells, and over time they may even take on a different shape and certainly a different function compared to the original cell. So at this stage here, it's still a benign tumor. And in order for it to metastasize and move to a new tissue, it's got to find a source of transport, either blood vessels or the lymphatic system. So what it will do in order to transport and metastasize is there may be a neighboring blood vessel here, and it will send out signals to this blood vessel to recruit the blood vessel to this tumor. That does a few things. One, that allows nutrients to feed this tumor, but more important for the tumor itself, not for the organism or the human, is that it allows for transport for those cancer cells to leave. And once they've hit the circulatory system, now it's capable of metastasizing, as long as the immune system doesn't get those cells first. But remember, I said that every time this grows and continues to grow, more mutations occur. Some of those mutations will allow the cells to evade the immune system. So they may now travel to a different part of the organism. So let's say this started off as a tumor on the skin, and now maybe it's going to move to the liver. And the liver receives a nice steady supply of blood, and so it's not surprising that at some point this malignant tumor or malignant cell will find its way to the liver or another organ. But in this case, it's the liver. And once in the liver, it will recolonize and produce more of these aberrantly growing cells. And at this point here, now that it is metastasized, it is a malignant tumor. And at this point, we can say it is cancer. It has to grow and metastasize in order for it to be cancer. These benign tumors, technically we would not classify as cancer. They're benign. Just in case I don't mention this later, this process of recruiting blood vessels to the primary tumor here is something called angiogenesis. The process of recruiting blood vessels to the tumor. This is also, just so it doesn't always get a bad name, angiogenesis is really important in development as you're setting up the circulatory system, but also in adult life when we have a wound and we're trying to repair that wound. It's important to have the ability to recruit blood vessels to wounded areas. But in this case here, the tumor cells have hijacked this process to allow the tumors to metastasize. We'll come back to what occurs here and how it occurs in a little bit. But now I want to talk about epidemiology. So epidemiology of cancer. I think it's probably a good idea to first define epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the incidence, distribution, and control, or maybe treatment, of a particular disease. And in this case, we're talking about cancer. But epidemiologists study all kinds of diseases. But we want to talk about cancer today. And the reason why this is really important to understand the epidemiology of cancer, where it occurs, how often it occurs, is that it helps us understand how to prevent cancer. This is probably the best treatment for cancer, is by preventing it from occurring. One thing that epidemiologists discovered a while back was that different countries have different prevalences of cancer. Don't be jealous of my drawing. Again, this might be one of the last drawings I get to draw here, but this here is, of course, the United States. And I'll draw Africa down here. Of course, what else could that be? And I'll draw South America here. And here is Europe and Asia. I'm not even going to try to draw that. There you go. And of course we have Australia down here. Now what epidemiologists have discovered is that certain areas of the world have higher cancer rates. And so let's signify that with red. And some parts of the world have different kinds of cancers more common than in other parts of the world. But let's just think about big picture here. Higher cancer rates and lower cancer rates. We'll show that in green. I guess to be fair, we should have also drawn Canada here and Mexico here. So we know that in general, cancer is much more common in industrialized parts of the world. So up here in Canada, the United States, but less common in Mexico. Less common in parts of South America. But in some parts of South America, it's more common. And even some pockets in South America, it's extremely common. Australia, it is fairly common. Europe, it's pretty common. Again, more industrialized countries. It sort of has a medium prevalence throughout Asia, depending on which country you're in. By and large, with the exception of regions down here near South Africa, most of Africa has a pretty low incidence of cancer. So the question is the cancer caused by genetics, or you might say where you are born, or the environment? That is, where you live. Now, if you live in the same place where you're born, it's hard to pull these two apart. But we know that if somebody from Africa, or Mexico, or parts of South America, they move to regions where the incidence of cancer is higher, that they are more likely to get cancer. So on these red arrows, that signifies cancer increases. At least your chances of getting cancer. Somebody from Africa that moves to the United States is much more likely to get cancer. Somebody from Mexico that moves to Europe is much more likely to get cancer. The opposite is also true. If somebody from a region where there is a higher cancer rate, like the United States or Canada, moves to a region where there's less cancer, their chances of getting cancer go down. And what the epidemiologists have concluded from these studies, and there's been a lot of studies looking at migrant populations, is that the place you live or the environment that you're around is strongly linked to whether or not you get cancer. And it's less linked to where you're from. Now, I shouldn't have said genetics. Now that I'm looking at this, I probably should have used the word inheritance. You're less likely to inherit a gene that's going to give you cancer. Because we'll learn in a moment that cancer is most certainly a genetic disease. But whether or not you inherit that from where you're born is another question. And it's much less likely the case. But the environment has a very strong influence on whether or not you get cancer, as shown from these migrant studies. So what are some of these environmental factors? We could spend the whole rest of the podcast talking about environmental factors that can lead to cancer. But I'm going to highlight three, and three that epidemiologists have worked on to show that they are a factor. So unprotected sex is a factor. Not for all cancers, but for a very specific cancer, or very specific types of cancers, and those are the ones that are caused by sexually transmitted diseases, like the human papillomavirus, HPV. So unprotected sex will allow HPV to be passed between people, and once infected with HPV, particularly repeated infections of HPV, can lead to higher incidences of cervical cancers. In fact, incredibly high for cervical cancers. It's the main cause of cervical cancers. It can also cause an increase in anal cancers, various kinds of mouth cancers, and vaginal cancers, and penile cancers can all be transmitted through this one virus. And that's why there's a vaccine now that people can get that will help protect against these cancers. Now, most cancers are not caused by a virus, so having the vaccine and having protected sex is the best way to prevent these from occurring, as well as having annual exams to determine whether or not you are at early stages of these cancers. Obesity is another factor that epidemiologists have studied, because there are certain regions in the world where there's more obesity, and in those regions we see a higher incidence of some cancers like breast cancer, colon, and rectum, as well as some others. Another major environmental factor, which will not come to as a surprise to you, is smoking. Smoking, of course, is linked to lung cancer, but also many other cancers, such as bladder cancer. In fact, almost all incidences of bladder cancer are linked to smoking. Very rarely does a bladder cancer form in a non-smoker. Epidemiologists have shown that if we eliminated smoking from the population, we would have about 30% fewer cancer deaths. It wouldn't eliminate cancer, but it would eliminate about 30% of cancer deaths. So it's a major, major factor. Now, the thing that is important for us to keep in mind is that even if we eliminated all of these and other environmental factors, we wouldn't rid our society of cancer. Because at its core, cancer is still a genetic disease. And getting rid of these environmental factors, we cannot prevent random mutations from occurring in our genome. So let's talk about the genetic aspect of cancer next. So cancer as a genetic disease. Now, most diseases like Huntington's disease, color blindness, cystic fibrosis, which I'll just put CFS, hemophilia or PKU, Tay-Sachs, and many others are all the result of a mutation in a single gene. Now, not all diseases are the result of a single gene, but these and many, many others are the result of a single gene. And usually, these diseases result because of a mutation. So result due to a mutation that is inherited. So you may inherit the Huntington's disease gene mutation, the colorblindness gene mutation, the cystic fibrosis gene mutation. It's not something that occurs in a somatic cell. It usually occurs in a germline cell, the sperm or the egg, that goes on to make the individual. Now, cancer is similar and different than these other diseases. So cancer similarities to most of these other diseases. The first is that cancer results due to a gene mutation or genes mutations. And the reason we know this is that the environmental causes of cancer that we talked about on the last board act as mutagens. So these environmental causes we could call carcinogens, agents that cause cancer. And these carcinogens cause mutations in genes that then lead to cancer. In less common incidences, gene mutations are inherited. We often think of cancer being passed down, And in some cases it can be, but most cancers arise due to new mutations and not things that are passed down. But if you do inherit one of these particular gene mutations, then your chances of developing cancer go way up. It's just that they don't usually occur this way. Now let's talk about some of the differences that cancer has compared to these other diseases. So cancer differences. The mutations that cause cancer are typically somatic cell mutations. As I said just a moment ago, usually we don't inherit these mutations from the germline of our parents, but rather they occur in our somatic cells. Now, even if you do inherit one of these from your parents, cancer is the result of several mutations. So even if you get one from mom or dad, in order for that cell to divide out of control and form that benign tumor, and then gain the ability to recruit those blood vessels, and then to transport itself through the circulatory system and to colonize a new area of the body, requires several other mutations. It's estimated that most cancers require approximately 10 mutations. That's not a... And because of that, because you have to have about 10 mutations, cancer is typically a disease associated with older people. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. I know, and you probably know, some people who have developed cancer as a child or as a young adult. So it's not always found in older people, but it's more likely to be found in older people. And as you age, your chances of getting cancer increase. And that's because it takes a while for 10 mutations to set in to develop into cancer. Because our cells are very good at finding these mutations and eliminating them. So it takes a while for all those 10 plus mutations to occur and persist. So on the previous board, I said that, or explained how cancer was a genetic disease, or is a genetic disease. Now I want to talk about 5 causes of gene mutations that are linked to cancer. The first is that they can be inherited. Now this is not as common as many people think, but it still is a major cause of these mutations. The second is caused by spontaneous errors during DNA replication. As our genomes are replicated, it's done so very faithfully without mutations, but every now and then we do get these errors. We can also get these mutations from chemicals, and often when we think of chemicals that cause mutations or act as mutagens, we say they are carcinogens. These carcinogens can be found in tobacco. They can be found in other sources of our environment that we intake into our body. The next kind is called ionizing. The next cause of mutations include ionizing and UV ultraviolet light radiation. These can come from the sun, such as the UV. These can come from various sources like X-rays and other sources. The last cause are viruses. As I explained with HPV, viruses also can cause mutations. So some examples of this, as I said before, HPV is one of them. The Epstein-Barr virus, this leads to, and hepatitis B and C. Now these sources of cancers from viruses are more rare. In fact, only a few cancers are caused by them, but it does exist. So it is a form of mutations that we need to consider.